Okay, let's get started, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I see that we have a very committed audience here. So those of you who have come here for this session, we go with the assumption that you are really interested about India and Europe. And it's true that I'm very honored and happy to have this conversation with Madame Banashri, who, as was introduced, was the former ambassador before. I mean, she has an illustrious career, both Banashri and Christian, and it's indeed. I think we have like great speakers to discuss about India-Europe cultural exchange, challenges and opportunities. A little while ago, we were putting our heads around this topic, and we realized, in as much as it was extremely broad, it does offer us some openings to probably create perspectives for further thought. So we are going to keep this conversation quite informal, light, and we're going to be relying a lot on personal experience in our own fields of work to exchange information here. So that would be more or less the format of this discussion. And to get started, the word culture. It seems to be like quite a big word where we, often, come to a standstill with. And this perspective of culture, it would seem to be a more recent preoccupation in the ways we configure relationships between countries. Like earlier, if you were to look at the period between from after the end of the World War, we would look at it as something being quite determined by strategic partnerships in terms of ongoing ideologies of the time. But then from the 2000 onwards, we see a more nuanced understanding of how we approach bilateral relationships. And to extend, we now operate in the 21st century where these bilateral relationships work alongside with multilateral ones, and that would be a kind of a special case, as would be with now, let's say, India and Sweden, and then India and Europe. Yeah? So my question, perhaps I would start with you, Banashri, that in your career where you have been like formerly ambassador to, you were first ambassador to, you mentioned was to Hungary, right? And then during this period, which which would have been a very turbulent period, this was really in the thick of the Cold War. How did culture resonate as a term then? And how do you see it must have shifted now? And I will ask the same question to Christian, who was former ambassador, interestingly, to Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, and we would see some connecting elements here.
Good afternoon, everyone. The question that you asked about how culture worked as a bridge at the time of the Cold War, and the changes. In my personal experience, and it has stretched, as you have mentioned, across countries. I have to correct the impression. I haven't been an ambassador to all the countries that I've served in. I started off as a lowly third secretary in Paris, and then I went on to serve in Hungary and South Africa, Reunion Island, which I'm sure many of you have not heard about, but it's a part of France in the Indian Ocean, and then also South Africa and the United States of America. And this over a period of 1982 to 2016. The last 4 years were in Sweden, and that has, I think, given me perhaps a reasonably good perception of what makes Scandinavia tick. And it's really, I think, it has brought about in me a lifelong interest and passion for this region, which doesn't promote itself. Because that was the one characteristic I realized Indians and Scandinavians do not share. We share many qualities and cultures, but unlike Indians who are capable of presenting themselves and of blowing their own horn, Scandinavians really like to let their product speak for itself rather than them speaking on its behalf. But your question was something else. Culture, how did it change over time during the Cold War or later? I think culture in that sense is the one coin, the one currency, which never goes out of fashion. It was a great link between India and Hungary when we were there. We had hundreds of people coming for the Hindi classes, and fast forward to 2014 when we started Namaste Stockholm, and we had 25,000 Swedes, many of whom had never maybe seen Indian culture. They were thronging the parks to see the exhibitions of Indian culture. So I would like to tell my audience, limited though they are, that recognize the importance of culture exchange and of being open to other cultures. I think this is a lesson I don't have to emphasize too much in Kerala, because Malayalis have been a people who have gone out. Sorry, long answer to a short question.
But yeah, we could ask the same question to Christian.
No, thank you. Well, if speaking strictly about cultural diplomacy rather than culture, which is
very big,
very big, of course, the way we operate as diplomats in different countries through culture might differ significantly depending on the, let's say, core areas that our embassies would be working with. In India, we have more than 250 Swedish companies successfully operating. And of course, our very close trade relations make kind of the motor for both political dialogue and also for promoting culture. I have the experience, the previous experience of serving my country at much smaller missions, much smaller embassies in countries with which we have good, but not yet as diverse relations as we have with India. And there I found that culture is an area, well, if there are no trade delegations, no business delegations, there are very few ministerial visits to take care of, then obviously culture offers a window of opportunity, which I also did grasp in those countries. It's important to identify, of course, as a newly arrived diplomat, what are the areas which you would like to promote from different perspectives. Like, for instance, Sweden has for many years promoted the rights of women and girls. And how to do this in a country where there is not that much cooperation established. So in one of those countries mentioned where I used to serve, there is a rather vibrant contemporary art scene. Mm-hmm. And I introduced those themes of what we then had during the previous government, the so-called feminist foreign policy, through contemporary art, which was a much better way to promote these ideas than asking for a meeting with the chairperson of the Women, Children and Family Committee at the Parliament. By using visual arts, contemporary, bringing Swedish and local artists together for workshops and exhibitions, of course, gave a much bigger outreach in society. I've also been working with film productions in the same area. And you kind of, well, kill two birds with one stone is not particularly good expression because we want to have a positive agenda, but then you have both the issue and also you create a nice venue for exchange of primarily, I'd say, young, and in this case, female artists. And now I'm a very recent arrival to India. I came last September. This is my first visit to Kerala. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for a very warm welcome. And well, Kerala appears to me, of course, as a very interesting state with which we would like to develop relations. I think perhaps culture is a very well chosen area for cooperation, culture and education with this particular part of India with the highest literacy rate, and I mean, I just want to share my delight for being here today. It's a forum which I very much enjoy.
Thank you, Christian. And perhaps I would like to hold you back onto something that you just said and connecting it to what also Banashri mentioned. It's very interesting that when you talked about your experience in one of those countries where there were serious issues that had to be looked into, but then instead of trying to adopt a coercive political dialogue, I mean, these objectives were served through the medium of culture. Yeah? And at the same time, like have you also, we heard that, like Sweden, in a lighter vein, of course, we're not so good at promoting ourselves. But today, do you think in India, where we have a recognizable Swedish presence, and I know now that this is something quite big when we talk about AstraZeneca, you mentioned 250 companies in operating in India. So Sweden is becoming more visible, whether we talk about AstraZeneca, we talk about Volvo, or otherwise the biggest that we know now is definitely Swedish, IKEA. Sweden is more visible than it was now, let's say, 10 years ago. Then does it kind of induce a different approach towards how, Sweden may wish to engage with India in what would be the non-economic, non-political fronts, but at the same time tying objectives into this? So does it, I mean, because Sweden is more visible in India now, does it, entail different forms of, what we may see as country branding, where, in terms of cultural exchange, but this is just a broad term, but
Well, in terms of visibility, we of course hope to become even more visible. Yeah. This year we celebrate 75 years of diplomatic relations. This is something that is not unique. We share this date with many other countries, but still we were very early. Sent an envoy in 1948, something that we will celebrate during this year, and also, I mean, starting from the mid-50s, those Swedish companies were already here, and some had been here even earlier. I mean, we celebrate this year also 100 years of presence of SKF, and Ericsson has been here for 120 years. But post-independence, the late 50s and early 60s were decisive in terms of bringing Swedish industry to India. And Swedish companies also manufacture here. Now, as we celebrate these 75 years of cooperation, we have chosen to do so under the motto, Swedish innovation made in India. In terms of visibility, yes, I certainly hope that we will continue to be visible, and that the kind of Swedish imprint will even increase. By that, also bridges are being built, of course, and it's not only about our presence here, but also Sweden is well, Banashri, who has been ambassador to Sweden, you know even better than me about the Indian presence in Sweden, so I will leave that to you. But it's really, we are engaged in a bridge building exercise, very diverse and broad, of which this session is also a part.
Part of it. Yeah, thank you. So, taking on from there, Banashri, I think you have been, like you have represented India in historically very interesting times. One was when in the thick of the Cold War, and then your last mission, as the ambassador to Sweden, was in a completely different context. In the 21st century of different values, we have other historical developments, European integration, and there, but when you were, when you took over at the mission in Sweden, was this, what kind of a legacy did you have to, kind of change or to ensure that the work that you did would resonate with something, more content, because it's not the same Europe that we are talking about.
Well, Rahul, an essential thing is that a diplomat projects the country. And what you can project cannot be very different from what the reality is today. 20 years ago, you could get away with, painting over the cracks because you didn't have such excellent connectivity. Today, I think a diplomat has a more serious challenge, but it also depends on how you use the technology in a positive way. One thing you cannot do, as I said, is deny what is happening. Right. But you can use technology to try and present a complete picture. And that is where culture becomes, I think, a great tool in the hands of a diplomat. Media sometimes tends to project and focus on a small negative development. I think this is a challenge that any diplomat will face at different points of his career. And media will then focus on this one negative development, and you go closer and closer and closer, and you put your focus on that. As all of you know, when you do that, it seems like that one negative thing is the complete reality. And then culture, the perspective, the fact that there is a diversity, that there is democracy, there is dissent, that if it is highlighted, and highlighted again in an interesting way, again technology is relevant. The way you do it is relevant. For example, an ambassador standing up and giving a 10-minute speech on how wonderful and how democratic my country is and so on, and instead to have a discussion with a delegation which has come from your country of young people, let us say, representing different faiths, and them having an intelligent discussion. Which do you think gives a more effective message? So I think culture is a great tool which needs to be used carefully and wisely and imaginatively.
Why would you say carefully and wisely, Banashri? Why would you say, why carefully and wisely? You make a special emphasis of it.
Okay. No, because culture can be also misinterpreted. You can use culture also to give the wrong message at times. Yes. For example, unless there is an open mind to culture, unless there is a respect for culture. I will give you an example. It's now 35 years ago, but when the first performance of Bharatanatyam was done in Sweden, a newspaper described it as said, what can possibly interest a viewer when they see 75 different ways of tapping the ground? Now, if you just bring a Bharatanatyam performer to an audience which has never been, which is more used to ballet with, a song, a story and all that, and then you have this very precise, almost geometric dance, unless you build up to it, unless you give an introduction, how can you blame the audience for not understanding? That's what I think.
Yep. Okay.
You have to contextualize culture as you present it for the experience to give its best.
And does it also take us into the realm of what you mentioned, like the way a country is perceived, by another country, and what do we do to, realign that image, and how does it reflect on our values? So does it mean that at any given point of time, the challenges that one, as diplomats that you would face is to kind of negotiate this different interpretations of not just the country that you may be representing, but also how your own country is represented elsewhere? And what experiences could you share in this regard?
Which of us would you
we'll go with start with Christian.
Well, I would just like to mention before perhaps I reply to this last question, this most recent question, that obviously diplomatic promotion of culture is absolutely not necessarily for any political purpose. But it could also be, as the French say, l'art pour l'art pur, the art for art's own sake. Yeah. I think this is also important to mention, that of course we have a commitment to let our music, our dance, our literature, and our visual arts, just to mention a few areas. Also, cuisine could be added in a broader sense as a component in culture promotion. That we can also do this for its own sake. But then, of course, the question is, how many people do we reach by doing so? That is also has to be taken in mind. But not everything that we do can be for a massive audience. Sometimes one has to especially invite an audience, a target group. I think this is also important. Most embassies do, and then there are some who achieve more than others, and I think that Banashri's initiative in Stockholm is one example of this, where actually, well, you can speak more about this, but the establishment of a festival with broad outreach in a central location, that is, of course, a larger commitment than only inviting a string quartet and let the string quartet play for a limited audience. Yeah.
It's slightly at a tangent from what you were saying, but what occurs to me when I think back to my experiences is how often I found that the embassy does, especially in the field of culture, the embassy ends up doing maybe only 30% of the cultural projection or exchange work. This, Christian, I think is more true of the Indian case than perhaps of the Swedish case, because in case of Indians, what I experienced was in almost all the countries that I was posted in, that practically every Indian, and Malayalis of course stood out amongst the Indians, they are so proud to share their culture, so proud to share their festivals, so happy to share their cuisine. So you I would go and speak to a group and they would say, yes, we know about this because so-and-so is my neighbor and he's from India and he invited me to a Diwali, puja in his home. So we are so, in our national culture, I think somewhere, we are so used to sharing whatever we are, experiencing, our joy, our food, our culture. In the earlier session in which Christian was speaking, the moderator had actually brought out something that apparently there was this girl who had put out on Twitter that she went to visit a Swedish friend's home, and the Swedish friend said, just wait, and she kept her waiting for a few minutes, and then she realized that the girl was actually at the dinner table with her family, and she was completing the dinner and then coming rather than inviting her. And this apparently caused a lot of outrage in India. Now, I, having lived in Sweden, could completely understand that if you turn up unexpectedly in an Indian friend's home, they will certainly say, oh, come on, ek aur roti ban jayegi, or whatever it's there, we will share it. But it's just not in the Swedish culture. When they invite you, they want to put their best foot forward. So they will not just put whatever is on the table, they're not going to say, come and join us. So for me, that was completely, understandable that could happen. So you have to understand the context of what is going on. But coming back to the point, I found really that the Indian diaspora abroad are among the best unpaid ambassadors and promoters of Indian culture. I will just give you a very short anecdote. I had gone to a celebration at Scania, which is one of the big Swedish automobile makers. And it was something which had been organized by the Swedish and the Indian teams who had been working together. And for me, it really stands, because it's now 10 years ago that this was shared with me, but it stood in my mind, it stays in my mind. The Swedish team leaders said, we love the Indians because if we give them a mission, a job, they don't even go home till they have finished it. And the second thing they loved about the Indians is that they shared their culture with us. On the other hand, can you guess what the Indians had to say about the Swedes?
About the Swedes?
The quality that they really appreciated about the Swedes was that when you worked, you were respected for your work. You were given the position of your work. And if for something to do with your work, you had an idea, you could go even to the CEO. There was the hierarchy was there to organize, but it was not there as a prison for the natural innovativeness. And that made me understand why Sweden has been one of the top 3 leading innovative nations, So culture opens the door, but if you keep your eyes and ears open, you learn so many interesting things which can be useful even for the economic relationship, Yes. Yeah. So culture is not just, sometimes people tend to say, oh, culture is soft power, culture is just culture. No. Culture can have very, very serious economic benefits as well.
And speaking of which, since we're kind of moving towards, the last quarter of the session where we reserve some time for interaction with the audience, on a somewhat lighter note, but still related to our topic, is today if Sweden were to organize a Swedish festival, just as you said, like a Namaste Stockholm, if in India, what would it look like? What kind of values or what kind of message would be planned as a project? And who is the target audience here?
Something which is true about Sweden is that there is a spirit of innovation. Right. So I would think that a major public Swedish festival would concentrate on on Swedish innovations and point to the fact that there are so many things also in an ordinary Indian life that are connected to Swedish innovations. And also, I mean, you might wake up in the morning in an IKEA bed and you might turn on Spotify to listen to the morning music, I mean, just to mention two. And then when you go to work, you use the protection belt in the car, which is also a Swedish innovation. I think the zipper is also a Swedish innovation. So I mean,
so it regulates every part of our daily lives almost. Yeah.
Yes. I think we would build a festival around those themes, and of course add then music, which is a major Swedish export product. You would certainly have known very early about ABBA,
Yes.
and with ABBA started this development of the Swedish music industry. And I mean, Swedish contemporary pop rock music is today one of our major export products. Quite amazing, a country of 10 million inhabitants in far north of Europe, having produced so many extremely popular and successful artists. I mean, just to mention, I myself not so much into contemporary music, but Avicii, for instance, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, such a superstar. You have Ace of Base, Roxette, and Robin, and there are so many Swedish artists which are listened to and also not forgotten. They have made an imprint in the music history of the second half of the 20th century and definitely the first decades of the 21st. And then I think equality, also both gender equality but also equality in a broader sense would be highlighted. And in between, we would also have art for art's own sake.
And if I can add a suggestion, I think the way Sweden has been able to address the gender issue,
Yes.
where without any reservation you have so many women politicians who rise to important positions, and they don't have to be anybody's daughter or wives or anything. And that kind of value system, that is something that could also be shared to mutual benefit with India. And also your linguistic talents. I mean, when I landed up in Sweden, even though I had been handling India-Sweden relations for 2 years, I'd never been to Sweden. And my eyes were opened at how common English is as a language of communication there. And I realized that that was because in their television, their media, a lot of programs from abroad in English were shown, but not dubbed in Swedish, but with Swedish subtitles. As a result, Swedish children grew up listening to English being spoken by, in BBC accents or in American accents or whatever, and depending on which program they favored, you would meet a Swede who speaks with a BBC accent or an American accent, but they would speak it very well, while at the same time, they would be reading and talking very easily in their language of Swedish. So this is something that, of course, they share also with many of us. I'm sure in this room itself, there are many who speak English almost as well as their mother tongue. But finally, mother tongue remains your mother tongue. And, I think translation into what 6-year plan has done, translation into the mother tongue of the people here, Malayalam, of these Swedish classics, is going to be a big step, and I hope it will continue, into bringing the cultural exchange between the two regions together.
Now, this is very interesting, and I see that this is also something quite new as a development in my observation, and totally second your thoughts about like what by and large many people associate with Sweden. And I remember in my own experience as a student in Europe, there was always this discussion like, okay, we do not hear about Sweden in the newspapers. We don't read about it. In India, I think I would just like to find out from the audience, yes, when did you last read a newspaper article on Sweden as such? It doesn't, like occupy, like what you can say is media space. Yet, the fact remains that it is one of the most well-developed, like countries with the greatest, like great GDP, with and what you very importantly emphasize with great gender parity, and they're winning the Nobel Prizes. They are traveling around the world, and it's higher standards of living, higher standards of environmental concern standards, and projects which are all being directed towards something with a bigger vision. And yet there's no noise about it. Seems like there's some configuration which has worked right. But at the same time, and when we talk about Europe today, because that was the discussion with which that was the title of our panel discussion. And then, but do you think, Banashri, for you personally, like when we talk about Europe, there's always this gap that perhaps needs to be addressed. That when we talk about Europe, we by and large, there is a certain imaginary that is quite restricted to mainly Western Europe. Yeah, the Europe for an average Indian student would be so limited to what we think of Western Europe. But then that's what I was trying to ask in my previous question as well, that in the 21st century we talk about a very different understanding of the world. In terms of, it's even its own, political realities that have shifted. For example, when we talk about Europe, we do not talk necessarily about Central and Eastern Europe in the same vein, or nor do we talk about, like Scandinavia or Nordic Europe. They're not as visible. But this induces a certain constraint in, perhaps does it, my question is, does it introduce a kind of diplomatic constraint? Because on the one hand, India has bilateral agreements with all the EU member states, and also it works with EU at a multilateral level. And when we talk today in the 21st century about India and Europe, how European is our understanding of these aspects? I would like you to share your experiences or your concerns, remarks.
Sweden is currently the president of European Union.
Yes.
Currently the president of European Union, yet, as you said, for an average Indian, I think when they think of Europe, well, you tell me, which countries do you think of?
Let's pick somebody
United
from the audience.
Kingdom, France, Germany. You don't really think of Poland, you don't think of Sweden, let alone Norway, and these somehow haven't yet come up on our radar of the Indian younger generation. But even that I won't generalize, because during my 4 years there, and I'm sure the trend has continued, the number of Indian students who were studying in different universities in Sweden had been increasing quite a lot.
Definitely, yes.
So that does happen, and universities are a wonderful, I would say, hubs for exchanging culture, as we saw. In so many Swedish universities, the students would get together and organize India Day. So, the embassy got a big help from them as a result of that. But yes, I think this focus that we have on 3 or 4 countries in Europe, and I'm going to, because I've now been retired for 6 years, I can say, even in our foreign policy, there was, for a long, long time, a greater focus essentially on these handful of countries. Whereas rest of Europe, each country can have something very different to offer. With Sweden, as Christian has already emphasized, innovation holds the key. The young people of the two countries can come together, and I would suggest, Christian, that not just Sweden innovates and makes in India, but Sweden innovates for India. That would be great, because we have so many different problems which we are struggling with, whether it is in pollution, whether it is in safe transport, and so on. So if Swedish innovations chose some of the Indian problems to work for, rather than just, what is their commercial priority, they could find solutions which would have a huge market.
Thank you. Well, again, speaking about the importance of languages, of mother tongue, and also the ability to speak other languages, let me just mention that we are extremely happy to present at this Festival of Letters 3 books that have been translated into Malayalam by the initiative of 6-year plan books. When it comes to Swedish literature, now I think children's books and crime are two main areas where Swedish literature has been tremendously successful. And here we have one book by Kamill Lekberg, that is crime. We have Astrid Lindgren's Ronja, the Robber's Daughter, and now to be read in Malayalam. And Astrid Lindgren is the most iconic Swedish children's author, Pippi Longstocking perhaps, and also other. This is one of her later books, which she wrote towards the perhaps 4th part of her life. And we are now very happy that it's going to be read in Malayalam by Indian children. And this is actually a blend of both. It's children's literature and it's crime. it's a children's detective story. Jeremiah. So it's a duo, a girl and a boy, and they have their private detective bureau. And it's extremely popular, and I know from personal experience, being father of 3, of which one was reading extremely much and also writing a lot. The younger ones do not read as much as their older sibling, but this was something that triggered the love for reading also for a child who was not from the very beginning so much interested in taking a book in her hands. So highly recommended, and please visit the stand of 6-year plan books before leaving the festival area. And this is also a bridge building exercise between our countries, and we are very happy to be in the picture today.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian. I think